Thank you for joining us tonight for Hair in the Home, Tracing Hairwork's Trajectory from Professional Service to Domestic Craft with Sandra Klowak. This event is in conjunction with the current exhibition, Women's Domestic Artistries, 1860 to 1910, at the Farmhouse Museum on Iowa State University's Central Campus. The exhibition will run through October 2025. Support for the exhibition in this lecture is generously provided by Carol Pletcher of Ames. Be sure to join us also on February 23rd at 2 p.m. Central Time for a free 2-hour workshop where you can create a hair flower keepsake directed by Sandra. And if you're crafty, I encourage you to join us. This workshop is free, and for a supply list, please register online at the link provided in the chat shortly. Sandra is a hairwork artist living in Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. She's self-taught and creates art from human hair based on centuries-old crafts of Victorian hairwork. Sandra has led hair art workshops in collaboration with various local museums, as well as the Victorian Studies Association of Western Canada. She is passionate about local history and serves as chair of the board for Seven Oaks House Museum and Ross House Museum, both in Winnipeg, where she lives with her partner, 2 children, and most importantly, a cat. I'm a cat person. She holds an honors BA in rhetoric and gender studies from the University of Winnipeg. And I'm now going to turn it over to Sandra. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of this lecture. Her lecture is about 40 to 45 minutes. So please hold your questions until the end. Or if you think you're going to forget it, you can post it in the chat and we'll monitor that chat. Thank you all. And Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Allison. Excited to be here with everyone. So, why did rumors of grave-digging wig makers strike fear into the hearts of hairwork customers in the Victorian era? While that's a touch sensationalized, this question is a fun way of introducing some of the themes I'm going to talk about tonight. We're going to explore how hairwork's value as a product walked a tenuous line between authenticity and fashion, between sentimental keepsake and popular commodity, and how influences from the hairwork market and related markets like the false hair industry, as well as rumors circulating in popular discussion, affected customers' perspectives, and how that influenced the way in which hairwork was created, professional service versus homecraft. I'm going to start with an overview of the history of hairwork, and then we'll dive into what hairworkers, hairwork marketers, and fashionable publications were saying and doing during the mid-1800s to explore how consumers' views were changing and affecting hairwork's production. I've relied on several sources for this talk, and I'll share those sources at the end. Hair has been a powerful and valued material for ceremonial, spiritual, gift-giving, and memorializing purposes around the globe, going back thousands of years. In the 1500s, we start seeing the earliest examples of hair worn in jewelry in the Western European tradition, evolving from mourning jewelry, which was already common. Sarah Nahama provides a beautifully illustrated guide to Anglo-American mourning jewelry in her book, In Death Lamented. A few of these images are from her book, and the earliest image on this slide is from 1694 on the right. Prior to the Victorian era, hairwork's main focus was to memorialize the dead and serve as representation of the culturally prominent concept of memento mori, translation, remember that you must die. By the mid to late 1700s, wearable hair mementos were emerging as a prominent art form, and their popularity continued to increase into the 1800s, with a peak in the Victorian era in the 1870s and 80s. Hairwork comes in a variety of forms. In the 1700s, it showed up mostly as palette work, also called flat work, 2 examples of which are on the right in different styles. And flat woven hairwork worn discreetly on pendants, often with miniature portraits on the other side, as well as in brooches. We also see hair in rings, like the examples in the center, and other variations, like sepia painting, seen on the left, where tiny images were painted with a pigment made of crushed hair. These were generally not meant to be showy or draw attention. This hairwork was almost exclusively made by professionals outside the home. By the mid-1800s, more styles of hairwork rose to popularity, including framed hair flowers and wreaths, seen on the left, which acted as treasured parlor decorations and family trees, and table braiding on the right, which was possibly the most popular style in the Victorian era. It was fashionable for men to wear watch chains or fobs made from the hair of their wife or female relative, and for women to wear sets of jewelry braided elaborately from hair, like we see here. By this time, the trend had also migrated from Great Britain to North America and would grow in popularity there. From the last quarter of the 18th century to the first decade of the 19th, ideas of sorrow and sentimental expression, affection, eternal love became idealized. By the 1830s, hairwork's focus had distinctly shifted to reflect Victorian values of sentimentality and sincerity, and became connected to the idea of sentimental fashion, a way of publicly performing emotion, love, connection, grief, mourning, via what you wear. Queen Victoria favored hairwork, which greatly contributed to its widespread popularity, part of an era replete with strict and exaggerated mourning traditions created and enforced by the Queen. The mourning clothing industry was massive, with entire warehouse and department stores dedicated to it. But the 1800s also saw a shift from hairwork as exclusively a tool for mourning the dead to a focus on its importance as a method to document and celebrate family ties, friendships, and romantic bonds between the living. Worked hair, or often just simple locks of hair, were exchanged between friends, similar to the friendship bracelets of our childhood. Such hair could be preserved in a scrapbook, often accompanied by messages from the donor about their friendship with the album's owner, like messages we would have seen in a yearbook. It became very popular and fashionable to wear hairwork as a means to perform authenticity. By wearing hair, Victorians were able to illustrate in an immediate and socially acceptable way something important about them and their values, their social bonds, their emotions. In the book Love Entwined, Helen Schumacher presents a fulsome picture of the hairwork market in the United States, which generally matches the trajectory of the craft in the UK. Generally speaking, and certainly until the late 1800s, hairwork was made by hand by skilled professionals, not by machine. The handmade aspect added value as a sentimental object. From the 1850s to at least the 1880s in the US and the UK, professional hairwork was a lucrative market in large urban centers such as London, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, as well as smaller ones. Professional hairworkers operated out of small-scale, independent shops. Some clients would visit a hairworker directly or could go to their regular jeweler who would send the hair to a hairworker. If the latter, clients would likely not know it was subcontracted out. But either way, the client would have a personal, direct connection to a person in a shop. Independent hairworkers were surprisingly racially and gender diverse. From European immigrants to African Americans, males and females are all documented to have run hairwork shops in this period, some with significant success, keeping their business running for decades. On the screen, we see some examples of classified ads by hairworkers in the ladies' newspaper. One challenge independent hairworkers faced was that due to the nature of their business creating custom work, they had little need of stock, but their lack of stock in trade was a barrier to accessing credit, which hampered their ability to grow. Mail order hairwork appeared in the 1850s, and this is where we begin to see a common consumer fear come to prominence, that you could not trust you would get back the same hair you sent in. At this time, the first mass marketer and large mail order dealer of hairwork appeared in the US, Godey's Ladies Book and Magazine, and we'll talk about that more in detail later. Starting in the 1870s to as late as the early 1900s, large-scale distributors joined the mix. Customers mailed in their hair to a local jeweler or retailer, choosing from a catalog of style options, and then the company sent the work to contracted hair workers, by this time often working out of large factory-type facilities employing many people, though all the work was still done by hand. Those working the hair were largely female, while men were often tasked with creating the jewelry and findings that would go with the hairwork. On the screen, we see an image from Mark Campbell's 1867 hair braiding manual showing his hairwork and jewelry manufacturing division. Some examples of other mass marketers that added mail-in hairwork to their offerings are Montgomery Warren and Company and Sears Roebuck and Company, founded in 1886. Independent hairworkers persisted into the 1900s, but struggled to compete with the mass marketers who offered lower prices. Customers coveted hairwork for its ability to express highly prized values of love, affection, and grief. Wearing hair was a public statement, a performance of those values, and it depended on the authenticity and hyper-personal nature of the hair, that it belonged to your cherished loved one. It confirmed that you were an individual that valued the personal, meaningful token, in contrast to frivolous, mass-produced items. One of the value offers for the hair market was this perception that it helped you escape a type of Victorian era consumerism, despite the fact that it itself was, or risked, becoming a mass-produced item as it grew in popularity. Thus, the market held a precarious role. As Schumacher says, quote, "The market posed a threat to sentimental claims of intimacy and sincerity, but it was the market that offered visible, instantly recognizable emblems of sentiment." Independent hair workers depended on the public's view of hair work as both stylish and sentimental, fashionable and sincere. This balance was often tenuous, especially as the 1800s progressed and the process of ordering hair work became more anonymous. Schumacher mentions that in 1858, Godey's Ladies Magazine printed a note to readers that said, quote, "We don't purchase hair to make hair ornaments. This answer will do for about a dozen inquiries." Says Schumacher, quote, "The presupposition that Godey's trafficked in human hair bought on the market undermines the sentimental premise of Godey's hairwork business, that it was not like the rest of the market goods. The popularity of hairwork rested on an uneasy balance between its role as a commercial product and a sentimental good." Popular in ladies' magazines of this time were stories and poems on the topic of hairwork, including tales warning of how the anonymity of the market can spoil the personal gift. This type of writing challenged the large companies and pushed back on mail order hairwork, championing the added value of making your own hairwork at home. Even if the product was not as skillfully made, they said, it was certain to retain its authenticity, the most prized characteristic. You knew that hair was of your loved one. The main concern being voiced repeatedly was the possibility that you would not get your own hair back from mail-in orders, implying that wholesalers were mass-producing hair chains, throwing out the client's hair and sending in anonymous, emotionally worthless, pre-made chains back to the customer. And where were the wholesalers purportedly getting the hair to make these disingenuous pieces of hair work? Around the 1870s, the false hair industry was gaining attention. The UK and US were shipping in hair from European countries and to some extent harvesting in the US, where people could sell their hair for this purpose. And it was used to make wigs, but also false hair pieces, which were very popular, made from human hair that women could add to their own to add volume or cover up hair loss, basically like modern hair extensions. The public's view of the human hair market was not particularly positive. Reports were being published about hair being bought from, quote, loathsome and degraded women, or at the very best, peasant women, and also being fished out of refuse piles and gutters in Italy, and worst of all, pulled from the heads of the dead. They even mentioned that you could tell which hair was from the dead because the follicle was still attached. Not a great look for the industry, whatever the truth may have been. These fears were even enough for one woman to take out a patent for hair made from thread, according to Schumacher. I don't know that she had too much success with that product. Parallels began to be made from this industry to hairwork, threatening the concepts that made hairwork special. Hairwork retained value as long as it was not associated with this dubious industry of valueless hair. But mass marketers were struggling with the concern that they switched out clients' hair for pre-made items with imported hair. And as we'll see, this was often their own fault. So this brings us to the push to promote hairwork as a home craft and the burgeoning market for how-to manuals as the only way to completely ensure your hairwork was made from your loved one's hair. September 1850, the ladies' newspaper and Pictorial Times in London published the first English language instructions on how to table braid. I found it very interesting that they promoted it as primarily an economic opportunity for women, presumably to become part-time hair workers themselves. They also explained that hair is to be purchased for a few pence and that it is often imported from peasant girls in Germany, which is curious given that, as we've mentioned, hairwork customers were not interested in generic pre-made items. So who did the ladies' newspaper think their readers would be selling this pre-made hairwork to? In the same issue, we see classified ads by independent hair workers that, as I showed before, offering their services for custom orders. Here we have a timeline of how-to manuals across Europe, Britain, and the US, courtesy of hair worker and researcher Zen Hansen of hair anthropology, who's been doing a lot of fascinating research in several areas surrounding hair, including the history of table braiding. So we see that the earliest manual is from France in 1816, following one from Germany in 1818, both for table braiding, and following that in 1833 out of Stockholm. Then in 1850, we see the first English language instructions in the ladies' newspaper. And closely following that, just a few months later, Godey's Ladies Book, based in Philadelphia, published a very similar manual. We have a few more in the 1850s. And then in 1867, The Art of Hairwork by Mark Campbell, which was very popular. And in 1872, The Lock of Hair by Alexander Speed, which was unique in that it provided flat or palette work instructions. Now we'll take a closer look at more of these guides and what they were telling consumers. As mentioned, Godey's published a hair braiding instructional in December 1850. Godey's manual promotes it as a way of ensuring hairwork remains authentic, playing on the concerns we've discussed. Quote, by acquiring a knowledge of this art, ladies will be themselves enabled to manufacture the hair of beloved friends and relatives into bracelets, chains, rings, earrings, and devices, and thus ensure that they do actually wear the memento they prize, and not a fabric substituted for it, as we fear has sometimes been the case. Interestingly, Godey's got into the business of providing custom hairwork themselves, starting later in the 1850s. One would think this kind of fear-mongering would undermine their own enterprise, but their monthly publications show a brisk business in custom hair orders. In 1867, Mark Campbell of Chicago published his table braiding manual, which was very popular. It also included brief sections on his other hair-related ventures, wig making, false hair pieces, and hair dressings. Pictured here, as you can probably guess, is Mark Campbell from his guide. Campbell was an enterprising person working to create a hair empire in the 1860s and 70s, publishing manuals, making hair pieces, running a hairdressing shop, as well as jobbing, taking hairwork repair and mail orders from large jewelers in his facility, employing multiple hair workers. Campbell's hair braiding manual came with the now common warning, quote, persons wishing to preserve and weave into lasting mementos the hair of a deceased father, mother, sister, brother, or child can also enjoy the inexpressible advantage and satisfaction of knowing that the material of their own handiwork is the actual hair of their loved and gone. His manual also includes an overview of the trade of imported human hair. He explains it is used to make false hair pieces of various types and, quote, not a small amount is used in the manufacture of hair jewelry. Again, these warnings would seem to undermine his own endeavors as someone who both produced hair pieces with imported hair and custom hair work orders. In 1872, London-based hair worker Alexander Speet published the book A Lock of Hair, including a history of hair and hair work and a how-to manual for flat work. And here we see some images from the book. Yet again, the fear of anonymous hair was the reason for the manual. Quote, now we propose to afford a protection against this abuse. There is but one means of doing so, and that is by enabling anyone who wishes to preserve hair to do it unassisted. Meanwhile, Speet ran a hair workshop in London that catered to the elite, including English royalty. Godey's Ladies Book, Mark Campbell, and Alexander Speet all put out DIY manuals for hair work with warnings that creating your precious hair heirlooms by your own hand in your own home was the only way to ensure they were authentic. Meanwhile, all three also provided this very service they were warning against. And these warnings go back much further. According to Hansen, the earliest warning of this nature she found was in Emily Barron's German hair braiding guide from 1818. This threat of the cold, calculating market invalidating your keepsakes and the actual market actors providing these very products couldn't get any closer, often appearing on the very same page. As I try to untangle what's going on here, I can only approach it as a hair worker myself. When I provide hair work services to my clients, their trust in me is paramount. While I'm not a big enough shop to promote fear of mass production, since it's just me, that trust is still key as they mail me such a precious material. I wonder how someone like Mark Campbell worked this out for himself. Certainly, he was trying to branch out in basically every direction related to hair, custom hair work orders, DIY manuals, hair pieces, hairdressing. Perhaps you just have to try it all, even when some things conflict a little. Regardless, it's clear hair work occupied a very complex position in Victorian culture. Its popularity would almost necessitate a mass market, but the act of mass production creates the risk of destroying its authenticity and thus its whole point. So, were mass marketers really buying pre-made hair work wholesale and duping customers with it? Well, Schumacher points to French-born hair worker William Ernest Moutou, operating in New York City. In 1884, Moutou offered retailers, quote, wholesale prices for hair chain braids in assorted colors by the gross or dozen at half of book prices, end quote. This was shocking as it confirmed the long suspected fear that retailers were purchasing ready-made hair work wholesale. More and more, jobbers, the companies who supplied hair work to local retail jewelers, were offering hair chains ready-made, and thus so were retailers, including A.C. Beck and Company, Montgomery Ward, and Sears. Chains could be purchased by the dozen, clearly not custom made, fundamentally misunderstanding the value of hair work, reducing them to just a meaningless piece of throwaway fashion. This shift put actual hair workers in a difficult position. To stay in business, they would have to start supplying ready-made hair work, but this undermined the very authenticity of their entire market. In 1908, Sears offered a hair chain made to order, but with a caveat, quote, we do not do this braiding ourselves. We send it out. Therefore, we cannot guarantee same hair being used that is sent to us. You must assume all risk. Just below that advertisement was offered, quote, fancy woven 3-strand hair vest guard. We will not quote prices on this guard made to order as the braiding is machine work. Meaning again, these were absolutely pre-made. This is extra shocking as these were directed to customers themselves versus Moutou, who was speaking inside the trade. So the fear that was driving hair work into the home was by no means unfounded. And though hair work never stopped being professionally made, its transition from independent hair workers in small shops to anonymous mail-in enterprises by mass marketers encouraged its own demise. But each type of hair work had a unique trajectory in relation to the home. Table braiding was popular both outsourced and made at home, and several manuals were in circulation, as we discussed. Flatwork, one of hairwork's earliest forms, doesn't have as much evidence of popularity as a home craft. Since flatwork often sits within jewels, there is an added level of skill that a professional jeweler would bring to the craft, which may explain this. Still, Speet's manual is a comprehensive guide, and even if we have less evidence, it was likely done in the home to some degree. Wirework, or hair wreath making, which was unique in that it seemed to never have been offered professionally and was exclusively practiced in the home. And while, as mentioned, the professional hairwork trade saw both male and female artists and entrepreneurs finding success, the art of hairwork in the home, unsurprisingly, seems to be exclusively a female domain, fitting with many other fancy work and more practical home crafts done by women at the time. As both a hairworker and someone passionate about local history, I'm so grateful for the tradition of hairwork crafted in the home. So much of our past is dominated by stories of powerful men. Homecrafting and hairwork specifically is a valuable window into the lives of middle-class women, regular people who are creating these objects themselves with their own unique values and creative sensibilities. And while the artist's name isn't always attached to these historic pieces, hairwork allows women from the past to be seen, literally. In the styles of hairwork that use long hair, wreath making, and table braiding, it's primarily the bodies of women through their hair that persist sometimes centuries after their death to speak to us today. As we see these pieces of their actual bodies made lovingly into intricate art by female home crafters, we're able to connect to women's history in a truly unique way. I'm particularly interested in local history, material culture, and ways in which we can connect tangibly to the people of the past. I came to hairwork through exploration of local historic houses, where I would admire the stunning artwork made from hair. I'm based in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in the center of Canada. This map absolutely does not give you any sense of that. But anyway, on Treaty 1 territory, I'm about an hour's drive from the US-Minnesota border. Winnipeg is the largest urban center in an otherwise quite isolated prairie farming community. And this is a small snapshot of part of Manitoba. I'm now going to talk about my own experiences researching and seeking out hairwork in my local context. So you're about to get a completely one-of-a-kind virtual tour of hairwork in my province of Manitoba. It's a life goal of mine to visit every historic museum in my province, of which there are about 150. So far, I've visited 48. As you can see on the screen, these stickers represent those museums. A lot of them are in Winnipeg. And I visited a lot of them with my young family in tow. It's become a favorite summer activity, driving around rural Manitoba to visit as many museums as we can. And specifically, I'm on a scavenger hunt for hairwork. Out of the 48 I visited, only a quarter, about 12 museums, have had hair of some type. Those are the red dots on the map. So when we do come across it, it's really special. There are many different forms of hairwork, as we've touched on, and all of them can be found in local museums, though my favorite type, wire work, is the most common. This type of hairwork, which is one of the types I practice, is made by looping hair around a rod, fastened all the way along with wire, creating sculptable shapes that are used to create representations of flowers and foliage. And that's what we'll be doing in the workshop later this month. So up on the screen, there are a couple of historic examples toward the left, and then a couple of examples of my work on the right and bottom. Typical shapes are classic circular wreath, but also the U shape or horseshoe shape are very common, and also any sort of bouquet style that the artist has dreamed up. You never know what you'll find. As I explore museums across my province, it's interesting to note how hairwork is presented, which really varies from museum to museum. In some, it's hung in a dark corner, the staff knowing very little about it and perhaps even feeling uneasy about this strange artifact, while in others, it's in a spot of prominence and respect, showing off its unique artistry and the story of its provenance. Part of each piece's story includes the way it's displayed and how it's understood in this modern museum context. Often, pieces are anonymous, the names of the artists and hair donors lost to time. Other times, the artist or family has, within the piece or on the back, meticulously labeled each strand of hair with its owner's name. We sometimes see elaborate diagrams mapping this out. This too speaks to the piece's story and how the artist thought through how she wanted her piece to be understood in the future. If she took the time to ensure the names were included in or on the piece, we know how important it was to her that her family tree live on intact. I relate strongly to this, as a large reason I was interested in learning hairwork was to be able to provide these types of mementos for myself and my family. It's a way to live on, to not be forgotten. Another interesting angle from which to approach the search for local hairwork is through cultural backgrounds. Looking at immigration patterns in my area, which was known as the Red River Settlement during the fur trade, provides a view of hairwork that closely maps the broader history we discussed earlier. The first settlers in the Red River Settlement were French, followed by Scottish and English from Britain, as well as English Canada. These folks intermarried with Cree and Anishinaabe peoples who lived there, creating unique cultural groups of French and Scottish Métis, who play a huge role in Manitoba's modern day culture, in addition to Indigenous culture. The next wave of immigrants were the Dutch and German Mennonite settlers and Icelanders, and later Eastern Europeans, most prominently in Manitoba, Ukrainians. With others, of course, that is not a comprehensive list, but an overview. While my research is of course not exhaustive, so far I've only found hairwork in communities settled by Western Europeans, including Mennonites, which correlates to the countries we know were doing hairwork and putting out hairwork manuals. So far, I haven't seen evidence of hairwork in Ukrainian traditions, but you never know what we might find out there. In countries with diverse immigrant populations like Canada and the US, we also get to see the intermingling of cultures. One fantastic example of this is in the hairwork collection of a Winnipeg museum, for which I'm proud to sit on the board. This is Seven Oaks House, Winnipeg's oldest existing home, which was built in 1853 with parts dating to 1831. It was built for John and Mary Inkster, the heads of an influential Scottish Métis family in the Red River settlement. As I mentioned, Indigenous and Métis culture is very strong in this area, and our museum is an important part of that heritage. So we see a picture on the left from 1858 and a modern day picture of the house as well in its original spot with one building moved to the other side. This massive hair wreath, and apologies for the photo quality, when it's under glass, it can be challenging. It stands in the upstairs hallway of the museum. While we don't have information on where or by whom it was made, detail on this wreath points to some interesting possible local connections, particularly to the combined Indigenous and settler identity of the Inkster-Sinclair family. John Inkster was Scottish, while his wife Mary Sinclair was of Scottish and Cree ancestry. Her children were known to embrace both sides of their heritage in dress and custom, for example, combining or wearing moccasins with otherwise European outfits, and practicing both European and Indigenous craftwork, including beading. This wreath shows the use of white hearts, those red beads in the center, a type of bead commonly used in Métis beading. Also, the heart petal shape we see here is a common shape in Métis beadwork as well, including some cushions that we know the members of the family beaded, or similar to those, I should say. It's not to say that you never see heart shapes in hair wreaths. There certainly are, but especially with the bead element, it's a tantalizing possibility that the artistry in this wreath was influenced locally by Indigenous art. While we can't confirm the maker of this wreath is local, the possible integration of Métis crafting with traditionally European hairwork is really interesting. And this is the matriarch, Mary Sinclair Inkster. And this brooch contains braided hair, and it's another Seven Oaks House artifact. In this photo, which our curator estimates to be taken in the 1860s, we see Mary wearing this exact brooch at her collar. Definitive proof that hairwork had made its way to the relatively remote Red River settlement by that time, and here worn by an Indigenous woman. Our best guess for whose hair it contains is Mary's daughter, Charlotte, who died in 1845 at the age of 16. This is one of the most fascinating hairwork pieces I've come across at a local history museum and also still at Seven Oaks. All we know is it was found in the shed outside Seven Oaks House in 1993. This horseshoe wreath shape, made from braided hair flowers connected with what looks like braided green yarn, probably commercially dyed green yarn. We see several colors of hair. It's quite unusual to see hairwork made from just simple braids like this, let alone exclusively. It maybe have been a more accessible technique used by a child who was crafting, but either way, an example of someone doing their own thing with hair at home. Since it's unfinished, this piece gives us a unique inside look at the process. It lets us see how the locks of hair were fastened together in the center top picture there. We see adhesive as well as string. We really don't know anything about this artist or even the date, yet this piece feels intimate. There's so much life and story to this beautiful work in progress. And lastly, from Seven Oaks House, these table braided sets of jewelry. They were made from the hair of Manitoba residents Isabella and Samuel Dunwoody. And now moving on to rural Manitoba. This stunning hairwork piece is displayed at the Mennonite Heritage Village in southern Manitoba, which is an incredibly beautiful historic village, one of the best in the province. This hairwork piece was made in 1893 in honor of the 25th anniversary of Abraham and Katerina Reidiger with the hair of their daughters. This piece was inherited by their granddaughter, Elizabeth, who brought it to Canada when the family fled from the Soviet Union in 1925. I find the style of this piece just absolutely stunning. You can tell that the artist had a particular vision here. It's unique compared to other things I've seen, especially the metal embellishments. And this is one of my favorite pieces I've ever seen. This wreath is found in Souris, Manitoba at Hillcrest Museum. And all we know is that it was owned by a Mrs. Joe Scott. We're not sure if she was the artist or even what her first name was, since it's been replaced with her husband's, but it's something. And this wreath is found in the Toulon District Museum, north of Winnipeg. It was made locally in 1896 by Mrs. Christina Dix as she recovered from scarlet fever. It contains hair from her family as well as community members at the time. And this is another really beautiful piece. Despite her being ill, she had very fine craftsmanship. This wreath is found at the Minnedosa Heritage Village. The note at the center states it was made in the early 70s by Catherine McTavish, later Mrs. W.A. Grant, and that it was sent in by Mrs. R. Evans. I appreciate that we have the name not just of the artist, but of the woman who made sure this piece got to the museum. And sometimes you'll find hair in other forms in museums, like this box of hair at the Dairy Museum in the French town of St. Claude from 1922. Cheveux bruns à Marie Clandinin. There you go. It was worth keeping in 1922. This piece is not from a museum, but shared with me by one of my Instagram followers from Winnipeg. Shirley Watts is the proud owner of this beautiful hairwork piece, which was brought to Canada from Northern Germany by her grandmother when they settled here in the late 1800s. Shirley shared that this piece serves as a family tree with hair from several of her ancestors, though she sadly doesn't have their names. And I wanted to end by showing a bit of a comparison to my own hair work to a historic wreath, just to give you a sense of how long something like this might take. On the left is a rose that I designed, and making a rose like that with about 12 petals will take at least 5 hours. So if you can imagine how long it would take to make a dense wreath like the one on the right, it's honestly mind-boggling. And that includes different techniques of varying difficulties. It really is amazing how many hours were poured into the creation of these beautiful pieces. As I sit at my desk making hair work in my studio, I love to imagine all the women and men who did this before me, either to make a living or to take on the labor of preserving their family's legacy. It's beautiful local pieces like the ones we've just seen that keep me interested in the historic side of my craft and passionate about producing keepsakes for my clients. The history of hairwork is complex and rich and sometimes contradictory, and most importantly to me, inextricably tied to intimate stories of real people. And this brings us back to where we started, with the concept of authenticity being so key to this craft. Hairwork's magic, its power, comes from the real people it represents through its artistry and the hair itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I loved seeing the regional examples because at the Farmhouse Museum, we have one hair wreath, and we do know the family it was from, but we don't know all of the folks' hair that is contributed to the hair wreath. But it's a really interesting and kind of a highlight of our farmhouse tours typically. We deal with a lot of lace and and fluffy, frivolous Victorian things. And then you get to the kind of darker side of using hair, which is sometimes considered morbid. So college age students really key into that. We are going to open it up to some questions for Sandra. And so I will read on the chat here. Okay, looks like from Linda. Can you talk more about how they use them as family trees? Did they add on to it from generation to generation? I know of one with a wreath, then there are smaller bouquets in the middle.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it really depends because, as I said, it's just sort of whatever the people wanted to do. So a lot of these wreaths, you can tell there are many different colors of hair, but at the same time, many families would have similar colors. So it's hard to know if we don't have those grids showing which hair is which. But yes, I think that people did definitely add on as much as they could as people were born, etc. Often you'll find hair work that's missing one of the youngest kid because they thought they were done. They made a hair work piece of the family and then oops, they had another baby. So it's not always perfect, but I think that families did what they could. But it really depends. There's so much out there. There's no rules as far as what you'll see.
Other questions? Well, I have one. Do you typically work in the wire work form or style versus we saw some examples of the flat work with the kind of gold thread in there, or do you bounce back and forth in your personal practice?
Yeah, I do. As I shared a few pictures of the wire work. So I do quite a bit of that. That's where I started. That's the first type of hair work that I learned. And I do quite a few commissions in human hair and more recently horsehair in that style. So I'm working on a horsehair commission right now. And I also do flat work. So that can be used with human and pet hair. And pet hair is not so much historic tradition, but a similar technique has been adapted to work with pet hair. So I do commissions for remembering pets as well. And the flat work can be nice and versatile because you can have very short hair. You don't need very long pieces of hair to work with.
And let's see here. Scrolling. Emily has a question. Emily, I'm hoping my coworker Sydney can figure out how to unmute you. While we're waiting for that, Angela, one of our museum professionals in the state, what kind of tools are used for such fine work as manipulating hair? Have the tools changed much over time?
That's a great question. They have not changed all that much. I can't speak to every style of hair work. So I do the wire work and flat work. I don't do table braiding, but Zen Hansen, who I referenced, has been sourcing sort of those going by those traditional manuals. And so from my understanding, it hasn't changed a huge amount. We see sometimes lists of supplies, like a hair working kit that would be sold to hair workers. And I think that was something Zen shared as well. And it was for flat work, and you could see all the things that I'm using, and it was just very, very cool to see that there's such a connection to the craft now and then. Of course, a few differences here and there, and different people did it slightly differently, as is there there's always differentiations and variations in crafting, but yeah, it's for the most part seems to have stayed consistent.
Excellent. Catherine asks, how did you first get interested in hair work?
I wish I knew what the first piece of hair work I ever saw was, but I've been going to historic museums for my whole life, historic houses specifically. It's just, I've always been totally obsessed with it, even as a kid. And I'd see these pieces, and I wish I could remember what my first reaction was, but I've always just loved them. I've just thought they were the most beautiful and the most interesting and like kind of weird, unique, and so powerful. You're seeing someone's body. Like that's a really special thing. You're seeing the color that someone's hair was up to 200 years ago. And I think that's just such a powerful way to imagine them and connect with them. So I just wanted to do it and decided I'm going to learn so that I can make hair stuff out of my own hair. And then it evolved into doing it for other customers.
And give lectures in the US.
Yeah.
Back to Emily. I think, Emily, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello. I also asked it in the chat. Sorry, I'm in a hallway right now. I'm a bio major, and I really like genetics and stuff, and I also really like history. And I've looked at things, I've looked at like garments in the past and kind of been like, oh, there's probably some kind of sweat or blood or DNA on this that you could take and then look at. And then I kind of am looking at what you're talking about and kind of asking the same questions. And so obviously I don't have the knowledge to do this at this time, or I don't even know if it's something I would do, but in the future, just kind of to know what are the values about taking a little bit of hair from one of these wreaths to look at the genetics.
That is a really interesting question, and I can't say I've considered it. Certainly, there's a level of respect that we want to consider if that's what you're getting at, especially if it's the hair of someone who had passed away. Obviously, everyone has now passed away that are part of historic wreaths, but not all the pieces were mourning pieces. I think that's a really important question to ask. And I think that your ideas about testing that are interesting. What would you want to what would be the purpose of the testing?
I'm not sure. I guess we kind of talk a lot about, oh, this is what people looked like. People were shorter back then. People had maybe more this hair color, that hair color, or they had certain reactions to this or that. And a lot of that is like information that you could find in DNA, and to kind of maybe like do something with those myths to either kind of support them or reject those myths that we have about what people were like so many years ago.
I think understanding more about people from the past is always beneficial. And that's an interesting question on where the line is on, is it respectful or appropriate to be taking samples of their DNA when that's not something they would have consented to? I think that it's important to be cautious about that. I think if it was for a medical purpose that could, help humanity, that there might be that balance of the greater good, but I don't have an answer, but I think that's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Emily, I think you have a good ethics paper for your thesis. All right, so Clary says, I'm a hair worker from San Francisco. You mentioned you designed a rose pattern. Have you designed other, I think it says flower patterns?
It's interesting the give and take on your own unique work and what you're pulling from historic influences. I often look at historic wreaths to get ideas. And so then, it's hard to say this is my invented flower. That rose is one I feel that I've created. So I say that other pieces are more a hodgepodge of, you're choosing where to put a petal. You're choosing how to move this wire. It's really intricate and detailed. So every piece is going to be unique and the artist's own, but it's also connected to this whole tradition of people that have come before. And I would never, say I've invented this certain petal if it's been done before. It's just sort of part of this whole moving forward of hair work that we're all doing together historically and contemporarily.
Amy says she is looking forward to the workshop, but confused about the parts list. And we were just discussing this before we got on together about the glued strands. Could you elaborate what we should prepare for?
Yes, I was just saying to Allison that I should send out a bit more explanation because I saw that was a bit lacking, and I meant to add more. So I think we'll send out some more detailed instructions, but the quick overview is that we want to have the strands of about 40 individual hairs in a strand. glued at the tip with nail polish. That way we're ready to go. The nail polish is dried and we're ready to do the actual hair working and looping. So we'll send out some more details on that, but that's the quick answer.
And another one we were just talking about from Nicole, will the workshop be recorded?
Yeah, I think we're planning to do that.
Yeah. Also be respectful that Sandra does do this for a living, and so we can't just put it all out there for free. So it may be one of those things where it's up for a month or something like that and then disappears. And so don't let your hair art languish. Make sure you watch the workshop. Donna wanted to say thank you. Fantastic and insightful talk. Emily, we already got to. Linda, our museum has a hair receiver bowls. Were these bowls exclusively used to gather for wreaths, or were there other uses for the hair gathered?
My understanding is that they were gathered for a variety of purposes, wreaths and table braiding. And Zen can speak to a lot of hair gathering. She's an expert in that. She's been collecting her own hair for a long time. And you can use that for hair work. It's very meticulous, tedious work to get them all organized in strands, but was certainly done. But also they were collected for they're called rats, like padding, like kind of as we discussed in my talk, like hair padding, false hair pieces. So you could fill things with hair and then embellish your own hair with them in sort of a bundle, and things like that. So they were used for a variety of purposes related to hair type things.
And then Catherine has another question. So how archival is hair work? And I'll add to that, how do you take care of it? How do you maintain it?
So I can speak to my types. I try to ensure that all my commissions are created, or I do ensure that they're created with all archival products, acid-free products, just to be safe and to ensure that nothing, no damage won't come from that side of things. We see obviously hair can last for thousands of years. We see it in tombs, etc. So generally speaking, it's very hardy and there shouldn't be a problem. The concerns that you'd have to look for is if it were wet and could mold, that would be a big issue. I sometimes wash hair before I use it. Often I don't. It kind of depends on the situation. And sorry, what was the second part, Allison?
Just cleaning.
Yeah, so for wearable hair jewelry, my understanding is that it's braided so tightly, and I don't speak from personal experience, I don't do that type, but my understanding is it's braided so tightly that it's quite durable and that it shouldn't be damaged by the oils in your skin because it's, a body product and has oils on it already. You see some wear and tear in historic pieces that require repair, which is a very skilled it requires very skilled workers to do so. But it is quite a sturdy product when it's woven tightly.
Zen answered your question. Yes, to make hair rats.
That's what, hair rats. Yes, exactly.
Hair rats. I love it.
Yes.
Angela says, can you talk more about the racial dynamics of the hair work industry? And if you have any reference for further research, I would appreciate it.
Of course, I can't say that I'm an expert on this, and I don't want to speak above, what my area of knowledge is. I think with hair, as I think Angela is well aware of through her beautiful practice, that it is such a emotionally heightened substance. It has so much meaning. Hair has meant so much as far as how we see race and all of these concepts. One thing that I always acknowledge or have to acknowledge in my practice is that this is a European art that has often excluded people of color. I mentioned in my talk that there's that connection to some Indigenous folks locally, which I find interesting, but we can't ignore the fact that European culture was also pushed upon them in quite a horrible way. So we can't always know exactly that dynamic. Yeah, people of color were often excluded from that tradition. There are some racist views that I came across when researching the hair trade. So there would be a hierarchy of the hair that is valued in different ways. Blonde hair valued the most. Actually, white hair was the most expensive because you had to pick the grays out. That was kind of an interesting fact. But there would be this sort of, from the northern countries down to the southern countries, there would be views about hair being less desirable. So that is a huge part of this, and I'm very interested in learning more, but I don't want to say any more than that if I can't speak to it.
Another good research paper for some.
Yes.
Angela, get on that. All right, so Charlotte has, after the research you've done, and especially as a hair worker yourself, how much do you believe the rumors were true and the hair workers were using pre-made pieces?
Yeah, a great question. I have to say, at least by the end, that's the thing. The timeline is interesting. At least by the end, by the ads that we were seeing that I mentioned, they are clearly making and selling pre-made hair watch fobs. So that must mean that some people were buying it. So long gone were the days when it mattered that your hair chain was from your wife or your sister. It was just a popular thing, and every upstanding gentleman needed to have a hair chain. And maybe you didn't have any women in your life that cared enough about you to make you a chain, so you bought one. I do believe that was happening at least toward the end. What I find interesting is that these concerns were out there as early as 1818 and very prominent in the 1850s, when it's not quite clear when that would have started. So I think that there's more research to do in the details on that.
Andrea says, my family of Eastern German descent has a pocket watch and a solid braid of hair as the chain that is passed to the oldest son of each family generation. It is a beautiful piece, I bet.
Amazing.
Oh, and Leela's Hair Museum has a handful of Ephraim family wreaths. I think Leela passed away recently.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was able to visit Leila's hair museum last year, about a year ago. And yes, she unfortunately passed away. She had been in poor health recently. So I didn't catch the last part of that, but that tradition sounds really amazing in your family.
And Elaine says, are there regional trends in the techniques used across Europe?
I would say most likely, and I can't speak in detail to that. There's a very specific tradition in Sweden, and I think Karen Keenan is on, and she would know a lot about that. We have a lot of hair workers on tonight that are experts in these little areas. So the one thing I love about our hair work community is everyone's sort of doing their own little thing, and it creates this mosaic of expertise. But the short answer being absolutely, but I don't think I have the full answer.
The hair museum contains African American family hair wreaths.
Oh, yes.
So that goes back to an earlier.
Yes, no, and that is true. There are a few examples.
Well, I think that's going to be our time for today. I did put the registration for the workshop. If we've piqued your interest in hair art. Sandra assures me that you need to have zero skill to do this.
Oh yeah.
So please register. We'll provide that supply list, and we'll clarify about the gluing of the hair. Again, that's on February 23rd. I really want to thank you for your time tonight, Sandra. I learned lots, and it looks like we've got lots of applause from the audience. This will be posted on our University Museum's YouTube page. You just got to give me a little bit of time to edit it together. So hopefully by next week, it'll be up and live. Thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you so much, Sandra, for your time tonight.
Yeah.